Hello from the Channel studio in London and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches. I'm Teniola Uyitayo. On the programme this week, surviving unemployment and food shortages, Gazans turn to selling wild plants for income, plus aid agencies concerned as more refugees expected to arrive in Chad amid funding shortfalls. With food supply limited in Gaza, people are desperately finding ways to feed their families and to survive. At least 1 in 4 families now face catastrophic levels of food insecurity or famine-like conditions. After 5 months of war, young people are forced to collect and sell wild plants, which have now become a major food source for many in the Gaza Strip.
The journey begins in the open fields every morning as youth search for and gather wild plants that have been eaten as side dishes in the Middle East for generations and have now become a major food source for residents of the Gaza Strip. The living conditions of the besieged enclave have reached an abysmal state and are systematically deteriorating as the latest round of violence that began on the 7th of October 2023 continues to wreak havoc on the lives of Palestinian civilians. Residents say that the prices of these plants, which grow in the wild and provide little nutrition, have sharply risen after harvesting them by sellers became common practice. In the period before the war, edible wild plants such as cheeseweed were free to anyone who wanted to pick them, but now people are forced to buy them to feed their families, and depleted food stocks and scarce humanitarian assistance prevail. Ahmed Fayyad was a pharmacy student at one of Gaza's universities before the war. Like thousands of other youth, his aspiration to become a pharmacist has come to a halt as a result of the grinding war, which has forced him to take up a career in selling cheeseweed on the street to support himself and his family.
People selling cheeseweed just want to make an income and to work. I mean, they have to sell these against their will. There is no other source of income. People have been sitting at home for 5 months. People want to get money. They want to feed their children. They have responsibilities.
Abu Ali was displaced from Gaza City. He says cheeseweed is the cheapest thing on the market and is widely available. Other food items are simply out of reach.
There are people who eat cheeseweed daily. There's nothing else. It's the cheapest thing we can eat, and it is available.
Nearly 20,000 babies have been born in the enclave since October the 7th, 2023. Most of them in dire condition, as most of Gaza's hospitals are out of service as a result of the ongoing hostilities. Nutrition screenings conducted at shelters and health centers in January in the north found that 15.6% or 1 in 6 children under 2 years of age are acutely malnourished. Of these, almost 3% suffer from severe wasting, the most life-threatening form of malnutrition.
Malnutrition plays a major role in the number of children that come to us, and thus the number of deaths happening. When a child is supposed to eat 3 meals a day and he eats only 1, he's certainly ending up with malnutrition and all the diseases that come because of it. Let's also talk about hepatitis disease that's spreading widely in the country now. And that's also due to the lack of food. We can't even deal properly with 50 to 60% of the cases we receive because we have nothing to give them. The most we can do for them is either give them saline solution or sugar solution.
According to the World Health Organization, children are dying of starvation.
The 10th child officially registered in a hospital as having starved to death. A very sad threshold, similar sad as the 30,000 deaths we reached all over Gaza. And similar like those, these are official records. And as you all point out, exactly, the unofficial numbers can unfortunately be expected to be higher. The system in Gaza is, well, we said it many times, it's on its knees, it's more than on its knees. The freshwater supply has been cut off since immediately after 7 October. The electricity has been cut off since immediately after the horrifying attacks of the 7th of October. All the lifelines in Gaza have more or less been cut. UNRWA stated just this week that the aid supplies coming in February were only half of what has come in January. And we all know that January was not enough at all. People are so desperate for food, for fresh water, for any supplies, that they risk their lives in getting any food, any supplies to support their children, to support themselves. This is the real drama. This is the real catastrophe here. That food and supplies are so scarce that we see these situations coming up. And the food supplies have been cut off deliberately.
The Food and Agriculture Organization says over 46% of cropland in the Gaza Strip has been destroyed and 95% of water unfit for human consumption. According to reports by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the aid entering Gaza provides no more than 3% of the needs of the population. Before the start of this latest conflict, 500 trucks of commercial and humanitarian supplies entered Gaza on a daily basis. Today, that number has dwindled to approximately 98 trucks on average last month. The UN says it's been unable to deliver any aid since the 23rd of January to areas north of the Gaza Valley, where famine is looming and people have been forced to resort to animal feed to stay alive. UN humanitarians on the ground allege that aid convoys heading to northern Gaza come under fire and are being denied access by Israeli authorities.
It's very complicated at the moment because there is only the opening into Gaza from the south, which means you have to traverse an entire war zone from the south, extreme south, to the extreme north to deliver aid, whereas it would be much more logical, practical, and efficient if we had border crossings directly in the north, where you could just cross in.
Don't have the names.
The United Nations warned last week that famine in Gaza was almost inevitable. At least 576,000 people across the Gaza Strip, 1/4 of the population, reportedly face severe levels of food insecurity, and 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in the north are suffering from acute malnutrition.
Officials in Chad are concerned by an anticipated surge of Sudanese refugees in the weeks ahead as Sudan's army continues to wage war against the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The spike in refugee arrivals could worsen the existing challenges faced by the Central African nation, including shortages of food and essential resources. Chad has become Africa's largest refugee host per capita, hosting more than 1.1 million refugees from Sudan, Nigeria, and the Central African Republic. Sudanese refugees account for over 553,000 of the refugee population in the country. Many braved often dangerous and difficult journeys just to reach the safety of camps here.
I am from El Janina. During the war, a shell fell on my house. All my belongings were burnt. I only got out with the clothes I was wearing. My ears still hurt from the noise of the explosion. After that, I fled to Adre, and on my way, a group of men hit me. I stayed at the border for 7 days, and I didn't eat for 3 days.
Almost a year since the start of the civil war in Sudan, aid agencies say neighboring Chad urgently needs more humanitarian essentials and significant development investment to stabilize the fragile socio-economic environment, especially in the country's east, where refugees continue to arrive.
One of the most worrying things that I've heard over the last couple of days is we may see families at smaller numbers coming across the border increasing very markedly. There are constraints on our ability to be able to provide assistance into Darfur from Chad and from other neighboring countries, and the conflict and the war continues. So we're likely to see many more people come to Chad.
Last month, the UN urged countries not to forget about civilians, appealing for $4.1 billion to meet their humanitarian needs and support the people who have fled to neighboring countries. While about 1.8 million people have fled the country, 6.3 million have been internally displaced. Half of Sudan's population, around 25 million people, need humanitarian assistance and protection. Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces have been fighting Sudan's army for control of the country since April last year, in a war that has killed thousands and sparked warnings of famine. Encountering military setbacks in the face of advancing RSF troops, the Sudanese army has cut off aid delivery to Darfur in recent weeks. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says the situation has become a living nightmare.
In the space of 11 months, at least 14,600 people have been killed and 26 others injured. Actual figures are undoubtedly much higher. The toll encompasses thousands of civilians, including many children and women. Many humanitarian and health workers have also lost their lives as they worked under fire to help people in need. Sudan has become a living nightmare. Almost half of the population, 25 million people, are in urgent need of food and medical aid. Some 80% of hospitals have been put out of service. The apparently deliberate denial of safe and unimpeded access for humanitarian agencies within Sudan itself constitutes a serious violation of international law and may amount to war crime.
A new report by the UN has provided the most detailed account yet of the indiscriminate violence being perpetrated by both sides. The RSF and rival Sudanese government forces have reportedly both used heavy artillery and shelling in highly populated areas, causing widespread destruction of critical water, sanitation, education, and healthcare facilities.
For nearly 11 months now, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, as well as their affiliates, have been fighting a ruthless, senseless conflict. They have killed thousands, seemingly without remorse. They have manufactured a climate of sheer terror, forcing millions to flee. They have let the people who could not or would not escape suffer, destroying medical services and blocking humanitarian aid. And they have consistently acted with impunity and a distinct lack of accountability for the multiple violations that have been committed, continuing to stagnate on any talks and negotiations which would achieve much-needed peace, safety and dignity for the people of Sudan.
Despite the scale of the crisis, the humanitarian response remains woefully underfunded. The fighting shows no signs of abating, and as harvest season comes to an end, it's feared that as many as 1 million people could die as a result of famine. When Foreign Dispatches returns in just a moment, we turn our attention to the situation in Ethiopia's Tigray region, where the deadly combination of the aftermath of war and now drought leaves millions facing famine. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us on the program. It's been over a year since the devastating Tigray war came to an official end, but now the Ethiopian region finds itself in the grip of another humanitarian crisis, famine. Drought is threatening the population of Tigray, intensifying an already dire humanitarian crisis in an area still suffering from the effects of a 2-year conflict. This is one of the hardest hit drought areas in Ethiopia's Tigray region, where malnutrition rates have surpassed the emergency threshold. The drop in production of crops has caused food prices to surge to a 5-year high and caused shortage of seasonal farming work, making food unaffordable for millions of people. Many farmers have also lost their main source of income. To further complicate the situation, there is a public health emergency taking place across the nation with outbreaks of cholera, measles, and malaria.
In Tigray, like in much of Ethiopia from north to south, we're facing the results of an El Nino-driven drought, of different disease outbreaks, including cholera, of the knock-on effect of COVID and conflict, and the coping mechanisms of family are at the absolute stretch.
Every year between 2018 and 2023, the rains have largely failed across Ethiopia, with the more arid northern and eastern regions being the worst impacted areas and parts of the normally more fertile south. Despite being one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, the response in northern Ethiopia remains underfunded. Only 34% of the $4 billion UN appeal for Ethiopia last year was funded.
We need to support children and their families now during this upcoming lean season, which is going to stretch into September, to avoid the worst. We need to be able to support health extension workers, to be able to treat children against severe acute malnutrition and other childhood illnesses. We need to be able to get food aid to the 6.5 million individuals that are in need of food aid now.
For 2024, it's projected that almost 1 million children will suffer from acute malnutrition and around 350,000 pregnant and lactating women will be malnourished. According to doctors, the numbers of severely malnourished children being admitted have doubled since 2020 when the war between Tigrayan forces and Ethiopian and Eritrean armies began. A ceasefire was agreed in 2022, but the impact of the conflict still lingers, with at least 1 million people still unable to return home remaining in the region. And over in South Africa, there are growing concerns about the potential impact of climate change on the country's agricultural sector. Recent years have seen the country grappling with a series of natural disasters, including the current heat wave affecting parts of the nation. Experts fear that climate change could worsen these challenges, leading to price inflation on agricultural products. Our South Africa correspondent, Innocent Samosa, has more.
Vegetable company farm workers are in the midst of harvest time. A good quality product is set to hit the market. However, it all depends on Mother Nature. Climate change is accelerating, with more extreme weather ranging from heat waves, drought to floods. This indicates long-term shift in temperature and weather patterns. 34-year-old green beans farmer Sophie Musabeni is feeling the impact of climate change.
Especially for me as a farmer, I'm so disappointed with the climate exchange because there's a shortage of rain, and when it rains with a hailstorm, then it destroys my crops.
This has forced her to adapt.
So I bought a bigger pump, but we are having also a problem of load shedding. So sometimes there's no electricity and I don't have anything that I can use to support the pumps that I bought.
Recently, Stats SA reported a decline in agricultural production for the fourth quarter of 2023.
The strongest drawdown in terms of contribution came from agriculture, having went down with contribution negative 0.4 of a percentage point.
In a quest to address climate change and food security, the Mangosuthu University of Technology is partnering with Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University.
The first thing that we are working on is, number one, to develop a manifesto where young people in particular are going to commit themselves on how they are going to address all these issues of energy, water, food, and climate change. We're going to be hosting a delegation of more than 80 students from the US, and we are sending invitations to all our more than 30 partners.
Well, the climate change bill is currently before Parliament, and it aims to develop an effective climate change response and a long-term just energy transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy and society in South Africa.
In the Solomon Islands, which currently ranks as the second most at-risk nation for natural disasters, many communities have seen the harsh impacts of the climate crisis firsthand. This is driving more people to move and uproot in communities, but the United Nations and the government is helping to build resilience. 2 weeks ago, farmer Sarah Diovi was growing bananas, cassava, and potatoes here when floods washed away all her crops. A new housing development and a shortage of other farming land on the island of Guadalcanal had forced her to start growing her fruit and vegetables beside the riverbank. Dealing with extreme weather events has become a normal way of life for the residents of the Solomon Islands. The worst floods were in 2014, when homes, forests, and whole communities were washed away. But every year, farmers are having to cope with damaged crops and disruption to roads, which cuts off communities.
Well, we are seeing now that many of the communities actually are not talking about if the cyclone is going to come, but actually when is the next cyclone going to come. And this is one of the things that we're seeing, the changing weather patterns, the fact that we have El Niño, La Niña is really affecting the communities. And now we need to make sure that we prepare them for disaster risk management, but we also support them in the droughts as well as in the floods.
In just the last few years, the UN's International Fund for Agricultural Development has been working with the government of Australia and the Solomon Islands to help local producers build resilience to these ever-increasing shocks. Meanwhile, according to a report by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, climate change is disproportionately impacting women farmers in low and middle income countries, causing billions of dollars of losses among female-headed farming households and widening the income gap among the rural poor.
The problem with climate change is it's not stopping, it's accelerating. So if we had another 1 degree Celsius change in the climate, it means that over time women would lose 34% more of income than men in situations in middle and low income countries where there's already a lot of stress on these households to produce enough income to feed their families and to pursue their livelihoods.
On average, female-headed households lose 8% more of their income due to heat stress and 3% more due to floods compared to male-headed households. According to the FAO study, closing gender gaps in farm productivity and wages within agri-food systems could boost the global gross domestic product by 1% and decrease global food insecurity by at least 2%, leading to a reduction of 45 million food insecure people. And that's the programme today, but remember our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelstv.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. Bye for now.